Pokemon Champions is finally here, and in this video I'm going to go over the basics for competitive Pokemon battling. The idea is to keep this video nice and short, at least reasonably short, so let's get started. So the way I see it, competitive Pokemon is divided into two sections, team building and battling. Both are equally important and both require a very strong mental game. Let's start with team building. More specifically, let's start with a Pokemon stats. So every Pokemon has 6 stats: HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. These stats are typically represented with this shape right here, and by looking at this, you can get a good idea of how a Pokemon should be played. Let's take a look at Charizard, for example. As you can see, Charizard has high special attack and high speed. This means that, generally speaking, Charizard is a fast special attacker. On the other hand, let's take a look at Annihilape. Annihilape has high HP and high attack. This means that Annihilape is a bulky attacker. So before we get into this, we should probably talk about the difference between attack and special attack. Every single attacking move in Pokemon fits in one of two categories: attack or special attack. These attack types are represented by these symbols. The little explosion thing is physical attack and the little spiral thing is special attack. Now, if a Pokemon has a high special attack stat, in most cases that means you should give them special attacks. Why? Because special attacks are calculated alongside a Pokemon's special attack stat against the opposing Pokemon's special defense stat. Meanwhile, physical attacks are calculated with a Pokemon's attack stat against the opposing Pokemon's defense stat. There's a lot of math that goes into this, but generally speaking, if you have a Pokemon with high special attack, give it special attacks, and if you have a Pokemon with high attack stats, give it attacks. So the next thing that we should take a look at is speed. As you can see, Charmander is faster than Annihilape. What does that mean? Well, Charizard, in most cases, will always attack before Annihilape. I know that seems pretty obvious, but I did say almost always attacks before Annihilape. There are exceptions, and that's called priority. We're gonna get to that later in the video though. So when you look at both their stats, what should that tell you about these Pokemon? Well, Charizard is a special attacker that is fast. Meanwhile, Annihilape is an attacker with bulk because of its high HP stat. Both these Pokemon are attackers, but they fill different roles. Charizard is faster, meaning once it's on the field, there's a good chance it'll attack first and it'll hit hard. Meanwhile, Annihilape may not be the quickest, but hopefully it can take a few hits and fire back even harder. However, their stats aren't necessarily set in stone. There are two other factors that need to be accounted for: nature and EVs. In Pokemon Champions, each Pokemon has 66 extra stat points that you can allocate however you'd like. A lot of times players use those extra stat points to make their Pokemon's best stats even better. So if you want a really fast, really strong Charizard, you can invest 32 points into Charizard's speed and 32 points into Charizard's special attack. The thing is that even though there are 66 extra points, you can only put 32 into a specific stat. This means that you have 4 stats left over. A lot of times people will throw those extra stats into defense stats, but it really depends on the Pokemon you're trying to build. Natures, on the other hand, give one stat a buff while another one a decrease. Once again, a lot of times people use natures to improve a Pokemon's best stats and lower their worst stat. A common strategy is to use natures that decrease a Pokemon's attack or special attack. Why? Well, because some Pokemon are attackers and others are special attackers. If a Pokemon is a special attacker, chances are you don't need to worry about its attack stat, therefore giving it a nature that lowers its attack stat isn't gonna really hurt the effectiveness of that Pokemon in any significant way. Now, once again, there are exceptions. There are exceptions to probably everything I'm going to say in this video, but for simplicity's sake, this is how natures are typically used. Okay, so you have your attackers and your special attackers, but now we need to talk about support Pokemon. In order to win a Pokemon battle, having the strongest Pokemon on the field isn't the way to guarantee that victory. Sure, it helps and it can put a lot of pressure on your opponent, but the most efficient way to win a battle is to have support Pokemon that can lift up your attackers. Now, the thing is that a lot of times support Pokemon don't have great stats, so their use isn't immediately obvious. However, there are some very good support Pokemon that people use frequently. A good one to call out would be Pelipper. Now, looking at Pelipper's stats, it's somewhat middling. Chances are Pelipper isn't going to sweep an opponent's team. but it has a lot of moves that could help your stronger Pokemon sweep a team. For example, its ability Drizzle automatically sets up Rain when it enters the field. What does Rain do? Well, it increases the attack power of water moves and decreases fire moves. This means that water Pokemon you have will deal even more damage. However, Pelipper has a bunch of support and status moves that could also help you get to victory. A common one is Tailwind, and basically this speeds up all the Pokemon on your side of the field for 5 turns. So even though Pelipper may not be a powerful threat, if it is played at the right time, it can increase the attack power of water moves, and it can make all your Pokemon a lot faster if it is used correctly. Another great support Pokemon is Amoonguss. Amoonguss, once again, doesn't have the best stats. It's a little bulkier than Pelipper, but it's not going to be outputting a lot of damage. However, it makes up for this with its robust move pool. Most Amoongusses run Spore, Pollen Puff, and Rage Powder. Spore puts other Pokemon to sleep. Pollen Puff can hurt the opposing Pokemon, or if you target an ally, it will heal them, and Rage Powder redirects attacks towards it. So even though Amoonguss can't do a lot of damage, its moves help it control the battlefield. This is a big reason why Amoonguss is considered one of the best support Pokemon of all time. In my experience, finding the right support Pokemon is the hardest part of team building because it's not as obvious as finding good attackers or special attackers. There are other factors at play here other than just stats. Like I said, having a robust move pool is super important. The ability can carry a lot of weight, and since stats may not always be the best, typing is also super important here. Okay, so now that you've built your team, you statted them out, it's time to give them held items. Held items are basically an extra perk you can give to a Pokemon. There are a lot of different held items people use, but I'm going to go over some of the most common ones you're likely going to see in Champions. A Focus Sash prevents a Pokemon with full HP from getting knocked out in one hit. It'll put them down at 1 HP, meaning that they might have an extra turn on the field to do some damage. Choice items are items that improve a Pokemon's specific stat, however, the first move it uses, it locks itself into. A Citrus Berry heals a Pokemon when it drops below half HP. Leftovers heal a Pokemon by a little bit at the end of each turn. Safety Goggles nullify the effects of powder-based moves like Spore and Rage Powder, and Life Orb increases a Pokemon's attack while dealing a little bit of damage each turn. And of course, there are Mega Stones, which lets you Mega Evolve certain Pokemon. There are so many held items though, and I've barely scratched the surface, so be sure to read up on all the relevant ones when you get the chance. Okay, so we've built our team and now it's time to battle. If you've noticed, competitive Pokemon is usually played in the doubles format. Why? Because there are more variables at play here. Now, that's not to say that no one plays single battles and that single battles won't be available. In fact, Pokemon Champions does have single battles, but I would say the primary format for competitive Pokemon is double battles, so that's what we are going to focus on here. The first thing we should talk about are weaknesses and resistances. If you've played Pokemon before, which I'm assuming you have at least at some point, you know the rock, paper, scissors style gameplay. Fire is weak to water, water is weak to grass, and grass is weak to fire. Now there are 18 types in total, and they all have their own weaknesses and resistances that need to be accounted for. Some types have more weaknesses while others have more resistances, so not all types are created equal, at least when it comes down to that type chart. The thing is though, is that a lot of Pokemon have dual types, and with that comes more resistances and weaknesses that you need to keep an eye on. So let's take a look at Gyarados' typing. Gyarados is water and flying. Now, in a sense, this may not seem like a terrible typing, especially because if Gyarados was just water type, grass attacks would be super effective. However, because it's water and flying, grass attacks have a normal effectiveness. That being said, because of Gyarados' typing, electric moves are 4 times effective. One Thunderbolt can send a Gyarados packing. Now let's take a look at Garchomp. Garchomp is ground and dragon, meaning fairy attacks are 2 times super effective against it. Normally, ice attacks are also 2 times effective against dragon, but because Garchomp is ground as well, ice attacks do 4 times damage to it. That can be devastating. However, the trade-off is that because Garchomp is ground, that means that it's immune to electric entirely. So what does this mean in battles? Well, it doesn't mean you shouldn't use Gyarados or Garchomp, it just means you need to cover for their weaknesses. Say I have a Gyarados on my side of the field and the opponent has a Raichu. A Raichu is very scary for a Gyarados. However, if I send out a Garchomp, that Garchomp covers for that Gyarados' weaknesses with its ground typing. Garchomp can basically Earthquake this Raichu into oblivion, and because Gyarados is a flying type, Earthquake won't do any damage to it. This kind of goes back to team building, but it's in your best interest to find Pokemon that work well together. This can be because of their abilities, their typing, their moveset, but for simplicity's sake, we're just looking at typing here. Now, moving past a Pokemon's typing, there are quite a few strategies you are likely to see fairly often in Pokemon Champions. This first one isn't necessarily an entire strategy, but a move that can set off a lot of different strategies, and that is Fake Out. I would say that any competitive player worth their salt likely has 1 to 2 Pokemon that can use Fake Out. So what does Fake Out do? Well, it has high priority, meaning it's likely to go first, even if your Pokemon is slower than your opponent's, and it does a little bit of damage and causes them to flinch. The catch is that Fake Out can only be used the first turn the user is on the battlefield. But why would you want to do this? Well, because Fake Out usually attacks first, you can stop a strategy in its tracks right away. Say your opposing trainer throws out a Pelipper, it sets up Rain, and it wants to get off Tailwind. If you Fake Out that Pelipper, it can't set off Tailwind, and perhaps you can knock it out in 1 turn, getting rid of their Tailwind user right away. On the flip side though, say your opponent really wanted to get off Tailwind, they might have a Fake Out user on their end so they can stop your Pokemon from knocking it out in 1 turn, so they can set up Tailwind, no problem. Speaking of Tailwind, Tailwind is another very common strategy you'll see in competitive Pokemon. What this does is that it increases the speed of all the Pokemon on your side of the field for 5 turns. This means that even your slower Pokemon might be able to outspeed some of your opponent's faster Pokemon, and I can say from experience, one of the scariest things in competitive Pokemon is when a strong and bulky Pokemon all of a sudden becomes a fast, strong, and bulky Pokemon. There is a move called Trick Room, and this basically makes the slowest Pokemon on the battlefield go first. A lot of times players will intentionally build a lot of Pokemon that are very slow, but have 1 Trick Room user, so once they get up Trick Room, all their Pokemon are going to be moving a lot faster than yours. Now, there are ways to stop these strategies in their tracks if you can recognize them. Like I said, Fake Out can slow this down a lot. If you spot a Tailwind or Trick Room user, you might be able to Fake Out into it, which will mean that they won't get it off. Additionally, there are moves like Taunt, which prevents the target from using status moves and forcing them into attacks. If you use this on a support Pokemon, their options thin out really quickly. Of course, if an opponent uses Tailwind, you could also just set up Trick Room, which will make it so their Pokemon are guaranteed to move last. And if they set up a Trick Room, you could use another Trick Room, which just reverses the battlefield back to how it normally is. But I would say this is where competitive battling starts to get really complicated. There are so many little interactions at play in any given game, and the only way to really understand everything that's going on is just to play. You need to get in those reps to fully understand all these different interactions and how moves work. That said, for those of you just starting out in competitive Pokemon, I highly recommend taking a look at weather teams. Now, there are 4 weather states in total. There's snow, sand, rain, and sun. However, I would say that sun and rain are typically the easiest to work with because they are relatively straightforward. Rain increases the attack of water moves while decreasing the attack of fire moves, and sun does the opposite. There are some Pokemon like Pelipper that can set rain automatically once it enters the battlefield. One for sun is Torkoal. Now, because Torkoal sets up Sun automatically, an obvious strategy is to bring a very powerful fire-type attacker or special attacker alongside Torkoal. Once Sun is up, you can devastate the opponent's team with incredibly strong fire attacks. A common strategy that people ran back in the day was bringing Hisuian Typhlosion alongside Torkoal, so once that Sun is up, you can use Overheat and just blast through everything on the opponent's side. However, there's a lot more you can do with Sun outside of fire-type Pokemon. For example, Venusaur has an ability called Chlorophyll. What this does is that it means Venusaur, a normally slow Pokemon, can move faster under Sun. What's better is that when the Sun is up, a move like Solar Beam, which normally takes 1 turn to charge, you can fire off immediately. Remember what I said about having Pokemon cover the other's weakness? Well, if you've got Torkoal out and you've got Venusaur out, water Pokemon all of a sudden aren't much of a threat anymore. There are similar strategies to this that you can find with rain teams as well, but a big reason why I always recommend weather to new players is that I find it much easier to team build when I'm trying to build around something specific. There are a lot of different abilities outside of fire and water type Pokemon that can benefit under these conditions. So all you really need to do is look for Pokemon that work well under these conditions. And if your opponent doesn't have an answer to rain or sun, chances are you're in really good shape. This is where, at least for me, team building starts to get fun because there is a lot of experimentation and persistence involved. You'll need to try out different moves, different abilities, different Pokemon, and then test them in battle to see what works and what doesn't, get rid of the stuff that doesn't work, and replace it with things that could work. This process can take hours, weeks, and months depending on how much you want to streamline a specific team. However, if you don't have that time, there are some resources that I highly recommend. The first one being Pikalytics, which shows you common ways to train popular Pokemon. Another one is Lab Mouse. This basically collates a bunch of teams from different tournaments around the world, showing you which Pokemon work well together and which don't. Finally, Pokemon Showdown, which lets you quickly train and battle Pokemon within specific formats in order to test out their viability. Of course, one of the best ways to learn is to watch people much better than you play, and I highly recommend checking out Wolfie VGC. I'm sure you've heard of him if you're at all interested in competitive Pokemon. I'd also recommend checking out Aaron Traylor's video on competitive Pokemon that really just shows how deep this iceberg goes, because it is extraordinary. Anyway, I know that I didn't cover everything in this video, and if there's specific things I missed that you think new players definitely need to know, please drop them in the comments below to help out your fellow trainers. And with that said, I'll see you next time.